welcome to the third annual Soros CEU lecture. This is a very special occasion for us, probably the most important lecture that we have during the course of the year. This lecture series was inaugurated 2 years ago, by George Soros, who at that time gave a series of 5 lectures, really beginning to explore what we have all become very familiar with over the last several years, which is the challenges and the contest over the principles of openness and democracy and open society. The lectures that were given in 2009 were projected to universities around the world and initiated a tremendous response in terms of commentary and the kind of activity that CEU likes to pride itself in being able to do, in stimulating debate and discussion. And that is exactly what we hope to do here tonight. One of the topics that George Soros explored 2 years ago was the whole question of how corruption can undermine democracy and democratic institutions. And at that time, he made some comments, and others did as well, about the particular challenge in the United States and other democratic countries of campaign contributions going to political candidates who are then manipulated, if they are in fact the recipient of very large-scale campaign contributions, sometimes coming in secret, manipulated in terms of what their votes might be, et cetera, and how that might undermine democratic institutions. Now, we all know that CEU was founded 20 years ago on the basic principles of open society, to promote open society, to promote democracy and democratic institutions through teaching and research and above all through learning. And at that time, we know there was a great optimism that was sweeping particularly this region. The possibilities of democratic transformation were underway. And this year, of course, in the last 10 months, we've seen a similar optimism that has swept the Middle East and North Africa. But always lurking in the background of this optimism and these great events are the threats that are in the background and can very quickly move into the foreground relating to the spread of open society. So the Soros lectures and the CEU Freedom and Democracy Dialogues, which we are also launching this year, are intended to explore what this contest over open society is all about. What is happening in various sectors of democratic institutions, and what are the threats that we are now becoming altogether familiar with. You all know them. Just a few to list: the economic crisis, to be sure, as a kind of overarching threat, and following from that, issues of nationalism and authoritarianism, xenophobia and racism, attacks on the rule of law, restrictions and censorship on cyberspace and other areas of democratic dialogue. And tonight's subject really grows out of many of these topics, and that is the problem of corruption. So I am very pleased to have as our third annual Soros lecturer, Professor Lawrence Lessig, who is here with us this evening. Professor Lessig actually taught at the CEU. I'll say that even before saying that he's now teaching at Harvard. We were pleased to have him as a visiting lecturer in the Legal Studies Department in the early 1990s. I've long admired his work on law and issues of technology, and I equally admire his new focus on issues of corruption, which we'll hear more about tonight. We were briefly, although at different times, colleagues at Harvard, at the Harvard Law School, where I taught before coming to CEU, and of course he is a very distinguished professor at the Harvard Law School. I'm also pleased to welcome in these very brief introductory remarks Monica McAvey, who will be coming to the stage following Professor Lessig's lecture. Monica is one of our, I would say, our very finest example of a CEU alumna. She went on after her CEU degree in legal studies to be the Minister of Justice in Romania, where she battled against issues of corruption at a very practical and political level. And she continues as a member of the European Parliament to be very active in this field, and we'll hear from her about the practical struggles against corruption in Central Europe, certainly in her own country, but also beyond, including, of course, throughout Central Europe. And I'm, of course, delighted to have my distinguished friend and Professor Istvan Rev, the director of the Open Society Archive, who will moderate this evening's event and who will introduce our speaker at greater length. But before he does so, please join me in welcoming Larry Lessig and eventually Monica McAvey to CEU.
Thank you. Now, I would like to tell you what is the plan for tonight. I will try to introduce very quickly Professor Lessig, who does not need an introduction, and Monica McAvey as well. And then Professor Lessig will give us the talk, which will last for about 45-50 minutes. And then the floor will be open for comments and questions for about 30 minutes, after which Monica McAvey will take the podium and will make comments based on her experiences in real life, if I may say that, for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then Professor Lessig will have the opportunity to respond if he wished to do so. And once more, the audience will be able to ask questions and make comments. So this will be a rather long evening. Our plan is to finish it around 7:30, as Professor Lessig has a dinner engagement around 8 o'clock. In his present life, Professor Lessig is professor at the Harvard Law School and the director of the Safra Foundation Center for Ethics. His latest book, Republic Lost, was published exactly a month ago, which is about all those problems, root problems that undermine democracy and the republic, and among them, the book is dealing with the issue of corruption. Also, as part of his present life, Professor Lessig initiated a constitutional convention in the United States to change the constitution and eradicate the root cause of the problems of democracy, that is corruption. He also started a movement called Change Congress, and in 2008 he contemplated about running for Congress himself, if I'm not mistaken, to represent the district around South San Francisco and Redwood City, the industrial and working class area around San Francisco, Stanford, and Palo Alto, a district which became vacant after the death of Tom Lantos, a very close friend of this university. But in one of his previous lives, Professor Lessig was a law professor at Stanford, the founder of the Center for Internet and Society there, the founder of Creative Commons. In that capacity, he came to us, to Budapest, and take part at the launch of the Hungarian version of Creative Commons, and I think that it's fitting that Professor Lessig speaks here, if I may say that in an immodest way. In a few days' time, we will celebrate the 10th anniversary of a small meeting that took place in this building, out of which the Budapest Open Access Initiative emerged, which played a very important role in the open access movement. And in that life, Professor Lessig was the author of several famous and now cultic works, like the Code into two different versions, Free Culture, Remix, and a few others, and several famous lectures as well. But in still a previous incarnation, Professor Lessig was at the Chicago Law School, and at that time he was the co-director of a program, a very interesting and important program called the East European Constitutional Review. And one of the other co-directors of the program, Professor Viktor Oshetinsky, sits over there, who is a professor of this university. And as George Soros has already mentioned, at that time, Professor Lessig was a recurrent visiting professor at this university. There was not quite a university at that time, but there were several departments, among them the Legal Studies Department, and he was a professor there. And I don't have time to enumerate all other previous incarnations. Let me say a few words about Monica McAvey, who, as we have just discovered, most probably was Professor Lessig's student at the Legal Studies Department at the CEU in 1992. She had a career in the civil society. She was the director of the Romanian chapter of Helsinki Watch. She was one of the founders of Transparency International in Romania. She was involved in the International Helsinki Committee, the archives of which at the Open Society Archives, by the way. And then she went into politics and eventually became Minister of Justice at a very crucial moment in Romanian history, at the moment when Romania was preparing for joining the European Union. And she played a very important role in helping Romania to meet the conditions of the accession. It was not easy, and she was the target of very vicious attacks during her tenure as Minister of Justice. After that, she ran for European Parliament, and you can't see this, but I have a copy of a poster, a mega poster from the streets of Bucharest from the European Parliamentary campaign with her photograph, and there's a sentence on it which says corruption produces poverty. I was able to download this picture because it has a Creative Commons attribution. And now she's member of the parliament and also an expert who investigates corrupt political practices in different countries, both inside and outside the European Union. Professor Lessig's lecture, Corruption, Large and Small, most probably is connected to his latest book, Republic Lost. I regret to say that this is a very fitting theme here at this moment in this country. While Republic Lost, in the title of Professor Lessig's book, although it's very serious, it's still metaphorical. You will talk in a country which lost the Republic in a very literal sense. In the new constitution, which is not even called constitution, but the basic law, which will come into effect on the 1st of January next year. Republic was left out from the 1989 constitution. Hungary is not a republic anymore, but Hungary is called just Hungary. Professor Lessig.
Thank you. Can we get the... So it's, I'm assuming our lights are going to come on, the technology will come on. It's so wonderful to be back. I don't know why my life is punctuated around Hungary. It was just about 30 years ago that I first visited here in the summer of 1982, when I was obsessed with the ideas of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet, well, what was then the Soviet republics. And then in '92, I began coming back to teach. And around 2002, I came back around the ideas of open society that became so prominently articulated here in Budapest. And I am extremely happy to come back a little bit in advance now, 2011, not 2012, when I expected the invitation. But it's wonderful to be here and see so many friends, and to be able to share this latest incarnation, as István Rev puts it. I hope it's not the last incarnation of my work, but I do hope, because it's the most important issue, that it's the one that might have the most effect. So I want to introduce this talk with 3 ideas on the way to an argument about something I think we need to do. So here are the ideas. The first idea, root striker. 1846, near Walden Pond, Henry David Thoreau wrote this: "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. Call that the root striker." That's the first idea. Here's the second. Independence. If this were an audience of Americans, when one says the word independence, the first idea that comes to one's head is 1776, when America declared its independence from Britain. But that's not the independence I mean to focus on. I mean instead to think about the independence that was at the center of America's attention around 1786, just the year before our Constitution was drafted, a year when most thought America was going to be a failure, when a certain lack of independence, what we could call an improper dependence, had shown itself throughout the American Republic in state governments that were deeply corrupted. A dependence which Jefferson described as, quote, "something which begets subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue, and prepares fit tools for the design of ambitions." This is what government had become. And what they sought in 1787 was a non-dependent, we could say independent government that could give the right answer for the right reason. Their common aim was a set of institutions, we could call them constitutions, against improper dependence. But what that means is for a proper dependence. So think, for example, about what we mean by independent judiciary. An independent judiciary is not a judiciary that gets to do whatever the hell it wants. It's not independent in that sense. What independent means is a judiciary that is, quote, dependent upon the law. It is the proper dependence which defines its independence. And that's true both here and elsewhere. Okay, that's the second idea, independence. Here's the final idea, trust. I want you to see the way in which trust is a function of independence. So here's a chemical which I'm sure most of you recognize. I, of course, a lawyer, don't. This is bisphenol A, or otherwise known as BPA. This is a chemical which is spread throughout our lives, especially in the United States. 90% of males over the age of 20 will show extremely high levels of BPA in their system. That's raised a question, is BPA safe? And most of us in the United States think, sure, it must be safe. After all, we have extensive regulations to guarantee the products in our environment are safe, so why wouldn't BPA be safe? But it turns out the research about this chemical is quite contested, but contested in a very distinctive way. If you distinguish between industry-funded research and independently funded research, and research that finds some harm or biologic effect, and research that finds no harm or no biologic effect, there's a pattern here which will unsettle those who are convinced that there is no harm presented by the presence of BPA. And whatever you thought about this question before, now you are less sure. Or think about cell phones. Question about whether cell phones are safe. 70% of Americans are sure cell phones are safe, partly because, like cigarettes, we can't imagine living our life without them. But here again, the research is contested, and contested in a very distinctive way, leading most of us, after we recognize this contestation in the question, to be less sure about the question after we see that contest than we were before. The point is that our confidence here is affected by the presence of money. Not money in the simple sense, but money in the wrong place. Our confidence is affected when we see money in a place that might be affecting the judgments or results being presented. And the lesson that I want us to draw from this point is to maintain confidence, to maintain trust, we have to secure the right independence. We have to assure the proper dependence. In science, the dependence upon the truth, and in politics, the dependence upon the people, and in neither case, a dependence upon influence of money. Okay, that's the introduction. Here's the argument. My objective tonight is to talk about corruption, but in all philosophically oriented locations like this great university, we start by saying, what could that possibly mean, corruption? And ordinarily, when we use the word corruption, we have in mind images like this: Rod Blagojevich, the former governor of Illinois, convicted in 17 counts of crossing the legal lines, as in at least one context, he was attempting to sell the Senate seat that Barack Obama used to occupy. Or we think of Randy Duke Cunningham, a former Top Gun fighter who came to Congress and then sold his office to defense contractors and was convicted and forced to pay more than $2 million in restitution because of $2.4 million in bribes that he received. Or Jack Abramoff, who has just been released from jail, a lobbyist who was convicted and sentenced to 6 years in federal penitentiary for the techniques he used to violate and bring about influence. Or William Jefferson, who was discovered to have $90,000 in his freezer from a sting operation, convicted and sent to jail for 13 years, the longest conviction of any member of Congress for bribery. That is the image of corruption we ordinarily have in our heads. Corruption as in corrupt souls, as in evil souls, as in people who are guilty of breaking the law. That's what corruption means. But it's important to recognize that's not the only sense of corruption. If there are bad souls, we can distinguish good souls from them. If there's illegal corruption, we might think of legal corruption. And what I want to suggest is that we actually have a matrix here. And while Rod Blagojevich might sit in the bad and illegal corruption box, and Jack Abramoff properly should sit in the bad and illegal corruption box, he actually now in his recent book insists that what he was engaged in was legal activity that might have this bad and negative effect. And this category can't exist if it's illegal. You can't be good engaging in it. I want us to recognize the way in which this institution lives within this interesting box of the matrix, filled with good people, with good souls, who are trying to do the right thing, engaging in activity which is quintessentially legal, which doesn't cross any line at all, yet which has a corrupting influence inside of the democracy. So how is it we could have good and legal be defined as corrupt? Well, stay with me here and watch, and I will show you right now. Okay, so I need to start, though, by a little bit of brainwashing to get you to the place where you might recognize this pattern as corruption despite it being legal and good. So here's some examples. As was said in the introduction, I spent many years of my life focused on the question of the regulation of culture through copyright. And I became a copyright activist on October 27th, 1998, when President Bill Clinton signed into law a statute honoring this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. Now, what the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act did was extend the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. And the question that Congress was to ask when they extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years was, does it advance the public good to extend the term of an existing copyright? Now, copyrights are to create incentives. What we know about incentives throughout this universe, not Star Trek, but in this universe, is incentives are prospective. They are about creating the incentive to do something in the future. Not even the United States Congress can get George Gershwin to produce anything more. So it can't possibly make sense to extend the term of an existing copyright for the purpose of creating new incentives. And so obvious was that when we challenged this statute in the United States Supreme Court, 17 economists, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, including this this is the right-wing Nobel Prize winner, Milton Friedman, would agree to join this brief only if the word, quote, no-brainer existed somewhere in the brief. So obvious was it that you could not advance the public good by extending the term of an existing copyright. But apparently there were no brains in this place when Congress unanimously extended the term of existing copyrights. What there was more than $6 million from the Disney Corporation pushing the argument that to extend their particular copyrights would benefit somebody, at least them, despite its extraordinary harm to the culture as a whole. Or here's another example. Last fall, the Wall Street Journal began to be puzzled about the explosion of what they called temporary tax provisions in our tax code. So our tax code is, of course, a behemoth of complexity. And inside that behemoth is an extraordinary number of provisions that are set to expire after a limited period of time, usually 2 years. And when they expire, then there's what the journal called extender mania, as those who benefit from that particular tax provision furiously try to get Congress to extend it for another period of time. And the journal's question was, what explains the explosion after 1998 of these temporary provisions? Well, it turns out Ronald Reagan was responsible for the first of these temporary provisions. In 1981, Congress passed the Research and Development Tax Credit. And it was made temporary, but it was made temporary so as to test whether it worked or not. The Democrats said it wouldn't work, the Republicans said it would work. Their compromise was to make it temporary and then ask the economists, did it work? So when they asked that question to the economists from both the left and the right concluded that it did work. They all agreed that it did work. It was a great tax credit idea because it spurred a kind of investment that otherwise would not have been engaged in and therefore made sense absolutely to be part of our tax code. The puzzle is, it is still temporary, to this day temporary. So why is it temporary after 30 years of its existence? And the answer was suggested first in this piece by Rebecca Kaisar in the Georgia Law Review, where she writes, the principal recipients of the research credit are large U.S. manufacturing corporations. These business entities are more than willing to invest in lobbying activities and campaign donations to ensure the continuance of these large tax savings. Or the Institute for Policy Innovation put it a little bit more directly, this cycle has repeated for years. Congress allows the credit to lapse until another short-term extension is given, preceded, of course, by a series of fundraisers and speeches about the importance of nurturing innovation. Congress essentially uses the cycle to raise money for re-election, promising industry more predictability the next time around. Now, this dynamic is central to how DC works. We architect tax policy, in part at least, to make it easier to raise campaign funds, and not just tax policy. Al Gore, when he was vice president, had the idea of re-architecting the regulations of the infrastructure that carried the internet. And the basic idea was to take a chunk of that infrastructure and to move it under a new regulatory title that was fundamentally deregulated relative to the way it existed before at least the 1996 Communications Act. And when his team took the idea to the Hill, the response from the Hill was, hell no, and as summarized to me by his chief policy advisor, quote, if we deregulate these guys, how are we going to raise money from them? And it begins to dawn on you that we tax in part to help raise campaign funds. We regulate in part to help raise campaign funds. Campaign funds at the center of the architecture of this critical dimension of fiscal policy driven not solely by the objectives of fiscal policy, but increasingly by the objectives of campaign finance. Or here's one more obvious example. Think about Wall Street. We've just seen this collapse triggering in 2008 a collapse in the economy around the world. Why did we see that collapse? Well, in this book by Johnson and Quack, 13 Bankers, they attribute it to this perverse mix, this mix of both too little government and too much government. So too little government in the form of deregulation. Throughout the 1990s, the financial industry produced all sorts of new innovations for allocating risk, what we call derivatives. But because of a series of regulatory changes begun in the 1990s, these innovations were essentially invisible to the market. There was no obligation that be traded on public exchanges with transparency requirements or even anti-fraud requirements attached to them. So my colleague Frank Partnoy calculates that in 1980, 98% of the financial assets traded in the economy were traded in this public way on the public exchange requirement infrastructures. But by 2008, 90% of the assets traded in our economy were traded exempted from any of these obligations of transparency or trade on a public exchange or anti-fraud requirements, encouraging this extraordinary shadow banking market where no one knew what anything was worth or what was out there to be traded, which encouraged, Simon Johnson and James Quack suggest, the bubble that when it burst brought our economy down. But that alone was not enough. In addition to too little government, we had too much government. Because throughout the 1990s, the Fed and the Treasury behind them gave a clear beacon to the financial services sector that there was in effect a government guarantee that when this bubble burst, there would be in effect a bailout on the other end, producing what is officially the dumbest form of socialism ever invented by man. We socialized the risk but privatized the benefit. They got the upside, we paid the downside. Now I understand not everyone here is a lawyer, and this is a technical legal term, but this was an insanely stupid way to set up a financial services sector. And all that was before 2008. It gets worse after 2008, where the insult gets added to the injury that Congress had given us before 2008. Because after 2008, after we had seen the worst crisis since the Depression, after those independent of the crisis all tied the crisis in part at least to the misregulation of Wall Street, and after the dean of deregulation, Alan Greenspan, Ayn Randian head of the Federal Reserve, confessed that he had been mistaken when he assumed that the banks would act in the interest of the public as a whole as opposed to their own private interest. After all of that, Wall Street was still able to blackmail Washington, Democrats and Republicans alike, to effectively giving them a get-out-of-jail-free card and not changing the basic structure that led to the instability and this collapse. If the banks were too big to fail before 2008, they are only too bigger to fail now after 2008. Now you look at this and you say, why do we have this series of regulatory mistakes? And there are a lot of possible reasons. Maybe Washington doesn't understand the financial services sector, but here's the one thing we can be absolutely sure of. Between 1990 and 2008, the largest growth and the largest sector of campaign contributions come from the financial sector and the security sector. And in 2010, the largest sector contributing to the campaigns of Congress came from finance and insurance. Okay, one final example. I'm sure many of you, when you saw these pictures of the disaster in the Deepwater Horizon, thought, how is it that we could have such a substantial and experimental drilling platform created in the Gulf without extensive environmental impact and risk studies? I mean, after all, where I come from now, we've just spent 9 years and 10,000 pages of environmental impact analysis in order to permit the building of this clean energy technology to generate electricity in the Bay. So how long and how much analysis did they have to engage in before they built this experimental, extraordinarily deep water horizon platform? The answer is 17 pages of environmental impact analysis before it was exempted from any further obligation to demonstrate the safety of their project. 17 pages. So when Congress heard this, Congress, of course, was shocked.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here. You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.
Yet, of course, it had been Congress that had required the system of approval within 30 days. And you ask, why would Congress require approval, even in experimental drilling platform context like this? Well, there are many possible reasons, but the one thing we know is the endless campaign cash that drove to this particular answer. Now, my point is first this. There is no respectable liberal or libertarian or conservative who could defend these cases. Each of them is an abomination from each of these three political philosophies. So how is it they become part of our public policy? Now, political scientists are actually uncertain about this. They say the issue is complex, but here is what is not complex. You believe you know why. All I have to do is point at the money, and you believe you have discovered the root cause to this craziness. And my claim is, number one, it is because of cases like this that Americans believe money buys results in Congress, quote unquote. 75% of Americans in a poll I conducted for my book believe money buys results in Congress. A little bit more Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here is the one thing Americans agree about. Money buys results in Congress. Leading to number two, that belief erodes trust in Congress. Gallup calculated last year that 11% of Americans had confidence in our Congress. Things are better this year. It's now 12% according to Gallup. But last week, the New York Times and CBS released a poll that said that 9% of Americans have confidence in our Congress. And we should put that in some context. This is a part of the world where the question of a legitimacy of a government has been a salient question. What is the trigger for legitimacy in a government? Right? There were more people as a percentage of the nation who believed in the British crown at the time of the American Revolution than who believe in our Congress today. And so what point does a government have to declare bankruptcy, political bankruptcy, because it doesn't have the basic trust of its people? And that leads to number three. This low trust erodes participation in the democratic process. So Rock the Vote, an organization which registered and turned out to vote the largest number of young voters in the history of America in the 2008 election, and arguably delivered the election for Barack Obama, in 2010 discovered that the vast majority of their voters were not going to vote. So they asked them why. And the answer they got, by far, the number one answer was, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And that's an attitude shared not just by kids. The vast majority who did not vote in part because of this belief precisely. Now, my view is the Supreme Court doesn't get this yet, but this is corruption. It is not Rod Blagojevich corruption. It is not cash secreted around in the halls of Congress as corruption. Indeed, members of Congress until late in the 20th century had safes in their office. You think, Why would they pay members of Congress in cash? They didn't pay members of Congress in cash. Members of Congress would just discover bags of cash on their desk, and they needed a place to keep it safely. But that's not our Congress today. From that perspective, this Congress is the cleanest Congress in the history of Congress. The problem of quid pro quo bribery is not the problem our Congress faces. The problem our Congress faces is not a question of illegal behavior. It is not a corruption caused by illegal activity. Instead, it is a corruption relative to the baseline that the framers intended our government to act in light of. So our framers gave us what they called a republic. But by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And as Federalist 52 explains, what they meant by a representative democracy was a democracy that would have a branch of government that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. Okay, so here's their model of government. We have the people, we have the government. I do my own slides. That's really cool the way that bounces, right? So here, people, government, marionette relationship, so that the government feels its tie to the people. The problem is our Congress has evolved a different dependence. Not just a dependence upon the people, but increasingly a dependence upon the funders. As members of Congress spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back in power, they develop, as all of us would, a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust themselves in light of what they know will raise money. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she came to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. And then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now the point is, this too is a dependence. But it is a different and conflicting dependence from the dependence upon the people alone. Because, surprise, surprise, the funders are not the people. Indeed, if you have worked in congressional elections, you recognize the funders, the candidates pay attention to are those who max out in a political campaign. In 2010, 0.05% of Americans maxed out in contributions in a political campaign. 0.05%. So the Occupy Wall Street people are so proud of their slogan, we are the 99%, bad marketing. They should be saying, we are the 99.95% of Americans that don't have the access that the 0.05% of Americans have because they are the primary funders of these campaigns. This is a corruption. We should call it a dependence corruption. It is a corruption because the wrong dependence has been allowed to enter into this institution and thereby drive it away from the objectives it was intended to have. Now, what does this corruption do? Well, the simple way to frame it is it distorts what the democracy does. We can see this along two dimensions. First, along the substance of what a democracy does. But here, in recognition of the political scientists, we have to recognize this claim is a little controversial. At least precisely, the claim that we can show that contributions affect legislative decisions is controversial. So controversial is it that people who have an ideological commitment to doing nothing here have grabbed it and asserted the question about whether we can show as a conclusion that money has no effect in Washington. So, for example, the former chairman of the Federal Elections Commission said this in a radio interview that I was participating with him in. He said, quote, the evidence is pretty overwhelming that the money does not play much of a role in what goes on in terms of legislative voting pattern and legislative behavior. The consensus about that among people who have studied it is roughly the same as the consensus among scientists that global warming is taking place. Now, to be clear, Brad Smith is not a global warming denier. He is a corruption denier. He is claiming that we have no reason to believe that the billions that get poured into Washington are poured into Washington for a purpose or with an effect. I was so astonished by this claim that he made while I was on this radio show with him, that in the middle of the radio show I had to tweet it. Then I got into trouble because of my hashtag, but that just means Brad Smith. That's all that means right there. Okay, so what is the support for the idea that the results here is a function of money? Well, we've seen an explosion of empirical work recently that has begun to demonstrate this connection. My favorite is this work by Clayton Peoples that looks at 7,000 votes between 1991 and 2006 to conclude it could find statistically significant contributor influence in 7 of the 8 houses. The one house where there wasn't that influence was the house that passed the largest campaign reform bill that we've seen in the last 30 years. But more interesting is this work by Martin Gylens from Princeton. Gylens took 1,781 public opinion surveys where you could see the attitudes of people about what government policy should be, what the government should do. And then he narrowed that to about 880 of these surveys, where the views of the top 10% conflicted with the bottom 90%. And he asked the question, when the top 10% want us to go one way and the bottom 90% want us to go the other way, which way did Congress go? And what he found was, when Americans with different income levels differ in their policy preferences, actual policy outcomes strongly reflect the preferences of the most affluent, but bear virtually no relationship to the preferences of the poor or middle-income Americans. There is a vast discrepancy here between what Congress does if it were actually following the will of the people alone and what Congress does in a world where they are, in my view, following the proxy for the most affluent, the funders. Now, you might think maybe they're just doing what the educated want. And as a law professor, it's hard for me to confess. Turns out the educated are not the most affluent. Education is not a proxy for affluence. The most affluent are exercising their influence not through their good ideas, but through the extraordinary resources they are able to pour into this political system. So that's as to substance. Much more obvious is in the context of agenda. Remember, Brad Smith said that legislative behavior is also not affected by the fundraising game. So here's just one example. If I asked you to tell me what the number one issue that Congress spent its time on in the first 4 months of this year, we have a lot of really important issues. We have the middle of 2 wars, huge unemployment crisis, budget crisis. We're doing nothing about global warming. We have all sorts of healthcare issues to address. So what was the number one issue Congress paid attention to? It measured in hearings and in time spent with lobbyists. The answer is the bank swipe fee controversy. Bank swipe fee controversy dominated their agenda. Now you say, what's the swipe fee controversy? Well, when you use your debit card in the United States, the banks get to charge the retailers a certain amount of money. So the controversy was, do the banks get to charge more or do the retailers get to be charged less? Now, you think, why would Congress spend all of its time worried about the bank swipe fee controversy? Not that it's not an important issue, at least to banks and to retailers, but as far as issues that are important to America, why would this be the issue they pay most of their attention to? Well, the money quote, so to speak, in this article was this. It said, "Clock never ticks down to zero in Washington. 1 year's law is the next year's repeal target. Politicians showered with cash from card companies and giant retailers alike have been moving back and forth between camps, paid handsomely for their shifting allegiances." And once again, it begins to dawn that we set our agenda of Congress as a function of what will raise the most money if Congress addresses those issues during the time that they are debating or voting on legislation for the nation. So why does unemployment get much attention in our Congress? Turns out unemployment doesn't pay so well when it comes to funding political campaigns. Now, my view, this is a corruption, and it's a corruption that distorts this democracy, and it has costs. And the counterintuitive cost is that, in my view, the cost of this in plain sight legal corruption are profound and more significant in the American context than the cost of the quid pro quo illegal corruption. Okay, so there's not a corruption here, there are corruptions. Let's call type 1 corruption a corruption focused on the individual, on the law violator. That's the Blagojevich corruption. But the type 2 corruption is focused on the system. It's a system with the wrong dependents, producing distortions of that system and therefore also a loss of trust. Congress is the paradigm case of this kind of corruption, but not just Congress. So think about doctors taking money from drug companies and sitting on panels that review drugs. Think about the rating agencies setting up a business model where the people they were rating were the people who were paying them. Think about National Public Radio in the United States that takes huge grants from interests in exchange for doing stories about those interests. And surprise, surprise, the stories are not terribly controversial from the perspective of the interests. Or think about universities taking large grants from private interests and setting up research projects that are related to those interests. Or think about academics taking money to give public testimony, not grounded solely on what the academics thinks is right, but what the academics thinks might make it easier to secure such lucrative consulting contracts in the future again. All of these are cases that raise the potential of what I want to call type 2 corruption. All of them. Throughout our society, we have this dynamic weakening the institutions of our society. And what's hard from each of these is great and significant. It's the hard from the legal corruption is sometimes, I want to say, worse than the harm that comes from the illegal corruption. Both of them need a cure, but the cure is going to be different. The cure for type 1 corruption is typical punitive actions, increasing the penalties for corruption. A little astonishing that Jack Abramoff got just 6 years and is let out of jail after 3.5, but that's the nature of our punitive system for white-collar crimes as opposed to regular crimes. But the cure for type 2 corruption is a certain restoration, restorative measures that restore the institution's intended dependence by securing the independence that institution needs against these corrupting influences. Okay, that's the argument. Here's what I think we need to do. So the corruption that I've talked about in the context of Congress is only going to change when we change this improper dependence. So if the problem here is that the funders are not the people, the solution is a system that effectively makes the funders the people by giving them away. I know that looks like one word. I don't mean giving Congress away. I mean actually two words. Giving Congress a way to fund without Faust, right? Without selling their souls and without thereby alienating most Americans by convincing most Americans that money is buying results. And the one way to do this, and I increasingly think the only way to do this, is to commit firmly to a system of publicly funding public elections. To shift from a world where we have large dollar-funded campaigns to a world where we could have small dollar-funded campaigns. Now, there are many examples of this in the United States. 3 states right now, Arizona, Maine, and Connecticut, have regimes where candidates opt into a system where they take small dollar contributions only, and then those contributions are amplified by the government so they can afford to run campaigns where they never take more than a small contribution from anyone. There are many ways to do this. In my book, I map out a slightly different version. It's something I call the Grant and Franklin's project. It looks like this. You first have to stipulate every American gives at least $50. Grant is on the $50 bill for those of you who don't walk around with dollar bills in your pockets. $50 to the federal treasury in taxes. So under this system, what we do is we take that first $50 and we rebate it to the public. Everybody gets their $50 back, but they get it in the form of a democracy voucher. And with a voucher, they can then give this money to candidates, and candidates can take it if they limit themselves to take only vouchers or contributions capped at $100 a citizen. $100 is Franklin on the $100 bill, so either $50 from the voucher or $100 from citizens. Now, $50 for each voter is $6 billion in the election system. 2010, we spent a total, all campaigns, of $1.8 billion. So this is real money. This is a large infusion of money into the system, but through small dollar contributions only. And whether it's this system or another, the thing to focus on is that if you had an election where candidates took small dollar contributions only, then we could believe, as we all want to believe, that whenever Congress did something stupid, it was either because there are too many Democrats or because there are too many Republicans, but not because of the money, because we would have removed the essential component to that cynical assumption that what Congress is doing is just following the money. Okay, so that leaves the question, how would you get there? And my view is it's actually not hard to see the problem. Most Americans recognize the problem. It's also not hard to describe a solution. If we understand the problem, the solution seems to flow. What's hard, maybe impossibly hard in America, is to imagine the political movement that brings that solution about. And that's for a reason that was suggested to me by Jim Cooper, who's a Democrat congressman from Tennessee and has been in Congress as long as all but about 20 other members of Congress. And Cooper said to me, the problem with Congress is that Congress has become a, quote, farm league for K Street. K Street is a street where all the lobbyists in Washington work. So farm league for K Street means that members and staffers and bureaucrats have this increasingly common business model in their head, a business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. Public Citizen calculated between 1998 and 2004, 50% of senators left to become lobbyists, 42% of members of the House. Those numbers have only gone up since 2004. This is a system where everyone depends upon the system surviving. And so if you have a world where everyone depends upon the corruption surviving, how would you begin to change that world from the inside? And the answer is you can't. What we need here is a way around the cancer that has become life within the beltway of Washington, D.C., a way to restore the people to the primary dependency and to, in some sense, even give Congress a chance to become more popular than King George was in 1776. Now, we don't actually know, I think, whether it's possible. We're at a stage, I think, in America where it's not clear we have the political capacity to build the movement strong enough to overcome this kind of corruption. But I do think we know how it starts. And it starts with two critical elements. Number one, it starts with clarity. The clarity of Thoreau, the clarity of a root striker. So it might not surprise you that the Occupy movement with the coolest website is the Occupy Seattle movement, with all the coders from Microsoft who are eager to help the occupiers. And if you go to the Occupy Seattle site and you start looking at their demands, what you see are literally hundreds of demands for reform. Everything from protecting the environment to ending the industrial prison complex, bizarrely, right? Now, the point is, if you think of these hundreds of demands, this is just noise to most Americans. We can't understand what this movement is about. What are people really upset about? And I think that suggests the way in which this movement has to mature. It needs to celebrate the diversity in America. There are people on the left, not really far left, I admit that, but still, there are people on the left relative to the people on the far right that exist in the United States, and we are different. And we have different views and different values, and we should respect and not require anybody to compromise those differences. But we have to seek common ground among these diverse views. Because if this is a movement that seeks to speak for the 99%, it actually has to say something that 99% could agree with. So there's an exercise I think the movement needs to engage in where it sits down and tries to list what we on the left believe, and then what we on the right believe, and then look for those things that we, all of us, could say we believe. And I think if we launched that exercise and began to focus on the issues that get people angry and practiced a discipline of connecting the dots between these issues, whether it's healthcare reform for the left or government bailouts for the right, or global warming for the left or complex tax systems for the right, or financial reform for the left or financial reform for the right. The point is we begin to see a root cause here. And the picture of the root cause is this picture precisely. And a practice of being root strikers in identifying that root cause and getting the people to see this root cause is the first step to building a movement that could actually facilitate the transformation this democracy requires. The second thing we need here is courage, a particular kind of courage. Those of us from the elite, the hardest courage to practice. So Arnold Hyatt, the friend from Boston, is a very humble guy. This is the biggest picture I could find of him on the internet. He was the president of Stride Rite, which makes great shoes, including Keds. He's also a loyal Democrat. In 1996, he was the second largest contributor to the Democratic Party. And so in 1997, President Bill Clinton invited him and 30 other large contributors to a dinner at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. You can think of it as a dinner for these fat cats who were being asked to give the president advice about what the president should do for the remaining years of his second term. Each of them got a chance to stand up and speak to the president. We don't have any pictures. I kind of imagine when Arnold stood up, it looked something like this. He stood up to address the president, to give him his views about what the president needed to do. And what Arnold said was something like this. He said, "Mr. President, I know you're an admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I want you to put yourself in Roosevelt's shoes in 1940, when he reluctantly came to recognize that he had to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy." Because he said, "Mr. President, you too have to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Not a war against fascists, instead a war against an attitude that we fat cats have inside the system. A war against the idea that merely because you are rich, you're entitled to direct public policy. Merely because you've been successful in the market, you have the right to sit across from the president at dinner. People who have convinced America that democracy does not work because they've convinced America democracy is sold to them." Now, if you just put yourself in Arnold's shoes, imagining yourself in a small dinner with 30 fat cats and the president, there's a little bit of uncomfortable silence after he finished speaking. Nobody knew quite what to say. The only published account we have of that evening says that in response, Clinton effectively slashed Hyatt to pieces, humiliating him in front of the group. Now, I think that 14 years later, we all have to recognize that it was Arnold Hyatt that night who was right. We do need to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. But where Arnold Hyatt was wrong was in his view that politicians would wage that war. It wasn't going to be politicians. It was going to be citizens. It was going to be us. It was going to be root strikers. Maybe it'd be some of you. It's our job here. It requires our courage because it's our republic. Ours, not the politicians. They may have took it away, but we let them do it. Let me end just with one more story. I'm sure many of you, some of you, most of you were not born, but some of you remember 1989 images like this when Captain Joseph Hazelwood ran the Exxon Valdez aground in the Prince William Sound and spilled about 11 million gallons of oil into the ocean. This is Hazelwood calling in the accident. Sure, as many of you wonder, there was a big question after this accident whether Captain Joseph Hazelwood was intoxicated when he was captaining that supertanker. He denied it. He said he only had 4 vodkas before he got on the ship. His blood level alcohol indicated he had to be at least 6 times the legal limit when he got on board, but his lawyers fought it. There was a big fight in court about it. In fact, the court did not convict him. So let's say there's some doubt about whether Hazelwood was drunk. What there was no doubt about was that Hazelwood had a problem with alcohol. His mother testified that he had a problem with alcohol. In 1985, 4 years before the accident, Exxon treated him for his problem with alcohol. After the accident, Exxon's president said he thought he had mastered the problem, but in 1986, his driver's license was revoked for driving under the influence of alcohol, and in 1988, his driver's license was revoked for driving under the influence of alcohol. At the time he was captaining a supertanker, he was not allowed to drive a VW Beetle. Okay, now, but forget here Hazelwood. What I want you to think about are those around Captain Hazelwood, the other officers, people who could have picked up a phone, people who, while a drunk was driving a supertanker, did nothing. What do we think about them? And I ask that question in this way because as I think about my democracy, I increasingly think that people like me, we are those other officers. We are they. We face critical problems that require serious attention, requiring institutions, but the institutions are incapable of giving that attention. They are distracted, unable to focus. And who is to blame for that? Who is responsible? It is too easy to blame the Blagojeviches, to blame the evil people. It is the good people. It is the decent people. It is the people who could have picked up a phone. It is us. We, the most privileged, are responsible here. Because the most outrageous part of this story is that the corruptions I've described may have been primed by the most privileged, but they've been permitted by the passivity of the most privileged as well. Permitted. 1787, when Ben Franklin was carried from the Constitutional Convention, he was stopped on the streets of Philadelphia and asked by a woman, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" And Franklin replied, "A republic, madame, if you can keep it." A republic. A representative democracy. A democracy dependent upon the people alone. We have lost that republic. And the question now is whether we have the capacity to get it back. Thank you very much.